Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion, Tearing Down Government Silos, the Impact of Data Integration, sponsored by MarkLogic on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My panelists today are Thomas Beach, the Senior Advisor for the Office of the Undersecretary of Commerce for Intellectual Property at the Patent and Trademark Office, Kelly Chewbacca, the Chief Data Officer at the U.S. Postal Service's Office of Inspector General, Autry Kaluri, the Chief of the Decennial Information Technology Division at the U.S. Census Bureau, Naveen Vembar, the Chief Technology Officer at the General Services Administration, and John Bakke, the Executive Vice President of Customer Operations at MarkLogic. We spent the first part of our first two segments of here discussing data integration, data agility. The last piece, if you will, of the three-legged stool is this idea of enterprise data management, and really this bringing all the pieces and parts together. Kelly, you mentioned governance earlier on. I think a couple people have mentioned governance. Talk a little bit about how the Inspector General's office is doing data integration, data agility, all around this idea of enterprise data management. What's your approach?
Thanks for the question. So both at the OIG and at the Postal Service, we're really focused on a coordinated effort to centralize data analytics for enterprise improvement. And I think that this follows from a White House initiative right now. The White House Data Cabinet has been meeting with chief data officers and similarly titled personnel in order to accomplish this across the federal government. I think it's important to remember that we all have some form of data governance and data management. It's not always codified, it's not always consistently followed, but even if it's intuitive or it's just in our routines and processes, there's some way that we have of doing this. The idea is, how do we do it better? So the White House Data Cabinet has put together a working group that has developed a plan for increasing the data governance and data management across all federal agencies with structures for analyzing data maturity. And I think that's where it starts. Before you can implement a data governance structure in an agency that's consistently followed, has rules and processes and points of contact who are data business owners and make hard decisions about data, clean up data spills, even identify data spills, you first have to do an assessment of the maturity of the organization. In the same way that we don't hand out medicine to children without knowing how old they are, how big they are, we don't want to impose structure or governance on a system that doesn't meet it where it's at. So I think it's a starting point for us is to figure out where are our respective agencies with respect to their enterprise data management, their data governance systems and processes. If we don't have them codified, figuring out how to identify what are the routines and processes that we're currently doing, even if they're intuitive and unstated, and then build our data governance structure to meet us where we're at, to grow us into the next level of maturity.
John, let me turn to you real quick, because one of the things that I think Kelly talked about, which, by the way, I love the White House Data Cabinet. It's not a council. It's not a council. It's a cabinet. It's different. But one of the things you talked about is different levels of maturity. Talk a little bit about that idea.
Yeah, so I mean, I think where I sit in the ecosystem of the problem is really how to achieve those goals from a technology perspective. And so in modern database technology and in MarkLogic, we use a technology called semantics. And semantics is a way for us to sort of recast data definition so that if a data model exists from a higher power, a governance committee or a cabinet in this case, then where MarkLogic would help an agency is to allow it to fit into that more quickly with less cost, simply by basically putting data objects in an envelope metaphorically and keying that envelope on the data model that's presented by the government's committee. So I think from a technology perspective, that's where you're seeing data technology try to help solve that problem. Again, it's a huge organizational issue, more so than maybe a technology issue in this particular case. Yeah.
Tom?
So great point, John, and both Kelly. We are looking at the department level, so at Commerce being labeled as the data-driven agency. We're looking at creating a governance structure across all the bureaus, so we're at a maturity level that's fairly new in that sense to get across bureaus. But the way I look at it is a good example of how we at the USPTO end up being in the Vice President's cancer moonshot. So originally you would think, well, why is the USPTO involved in cancer treatment, cancer development, patient care, et cetera. Well, as a leading indicator of innovation and technology, it matters what we're doing today if we're going to make a data-driven policy. And what's really fascinating and able to do is to take a data-driven policy, use that as an umbrella to do data governance. Because saying you're going to go do data governance isn't the most exciting thing in the world. Let's get behind a mission. And the mission for us was to improve access to patient care. And how do we do it? We better understand what it is we have out there and access to. So we used the Challenge.gov for the very first time, created our own curated data set within the USPTO based on institutional knowledge, and combined it with a classification system. That's how we label our patents in a certain way. That is a new hybrid, created an API, put it out on the developer hub, and now you're starting to see how all these pieces can work in real time. Where we've built them, the ROI on this effort is we can now push out concepts. We got back 19 submissions in 4 weeks. Incredible work around mortality rates and clinical trial rates, data, as well as NIH funding, et cetera. So we asked folks, if you're the head of an agency, how would you make a data-driven decision on what type of treatments and technology should we be investing in? And it was fascinating to see what the median level of funding was and the impact of that funding, whether it was lung cancer or breast cancer. So we're really looking at putting it together under the mission.
And this is your first for PTO, first Challenge.gov?
First Challenge.gov.
Because you guys, America Competes Act, which really gave you a ton of opening, right? That was really focused on PTO.
Yeah, this was our first time with Challenge.gov, and it was an incredible ride. We've been on the Vice President's Cancer Moonshot Task Force team, and to have the pleasure of being there and hearing the Vice President mention the United States Patent and Trademark Office leading in the innovation stage, it's really incrediul. It's
big difference than when President Obama mentioned you guys in that State of the Union.
Yes.
We're turning to Naveen to get you out of that hole. You were kind of shaking your head listening to Tom about the governance piece.
I mean, I think the key thing here, right, it comes back to, so what are you going to use the data for, and really asking that question up front, and making that the keystone of the whole element of governance, right? It creates a real sense of focus to be able to say, well, the administrator needs this data to do X, right? So GSA, we work with other agencies, our customers are other agencies, and so when we talk about our data sets around how we're going to serve these other agencies, we have to look at it from, well, how do we integrate that into, our CRM environment, right? And how does that become valuable there? How does our administrator go on the road and talk to cities about how GSA has property within their environment, and what does that mean? And really sort of speak to those things, and then drive actually from that objective all the way down. One of the other elements that we've also really focused on is decentralizing sort of the access and ownership of this data, allowing for a data scientist who has the ability to write some code on their own machine to do some visualization or some analytics to do that work, and they don't have to be GSA IT, right? They don't have to be within that IT organization just because they happen to be writing a little bit of Python, right? Because they're working for the business on that side. And where that governance really comes into play is to making sure that because we have that line of mission from the top down, that data scientists can do their work, and that feeds all the way back. It's a good feedback loop.
And this seems to go back to what Kelly, what you were saying earlier about this data is not our data, it's all of our data, and if you can use it to make your mission better, that's better than the IG coming in and banging its fist to say you didn't do it right. Talk a little bit from a governance perspective. Is that the message that gets people on board a little bit quicker to, oh, okay, now I can picture that, versus why do you want my data all the time, or that's my data, don't touch my data?
We have a separate governance message internally for the OIG than we do for the Postal Service. We don't have much to do with the governance over there except for through our audits. And so we have had audits that come out and say your enterprise data would be better served if you have this kind of governance model. Internally, the message that seems to work the best is we need to know what data we have, where it is, who has access to it, and how we're using it, because otherwise, insert headline here. And whatever.
Picking on the media, I understand.
I know, right?
I opened the door, I walked through it.
Whatever recent data spill or data breach has happened that's gotten other agencies in a lot of trouble, compromised sensitive information, or resulted in de-appropriation, defunding, that's what gets attention. Especially, remember, in the IG community, we're very law enforcement, rules, black and white related, so that's very appealing. We want to be very careful with the information we have.
Audrey, fascinating conversation we've had today. Let me turn to you a little bit and ask what you've heard. We've had integration, we had agility, we had enterprise data management. Where is this all going from the census's perspective? Obviously, Tom talked about this Commerce Department-wide perspective. So talk maybe specific census and maybe talk a little bit also from the Commerce Department perspective.
Yeah, so at the Census Bureau, as I said earlier, our data is used to measure America. So we take it very seriously. Almost $400 billion every year is appropriated to the local governments based on our data. So it's important that we accurately collect the data and accurately provision the data for consumption, taking into consideration the privacy of the data, the confidentiality, and the disclosure avoidance. So we basically took two-pronged approach at the Census Bureau. One is for the data that we already have, how do we ensure that we allow for the research on that data effectively and efficiently? So we created what is called as a data management system with a secure access and avoiding replication of the data sets, as the researchers would like to use the data as much as they can. That has been working well, but we also took on this enterprise approach to data collection, as I said, the SetCap program. So what that allows us to do is to standardize the metadata that relates to our data. And that allows us to better understand the data and better provision the data for consumption. Until we have every program area transition to using the solutions that we are provisioning for the SetCap program, we are continuing to improve on the data management system that we have. Now, commerce-wide, I know there are quite a few initiatives to ensure that there is data integration across the bureaus. As Tom mentioned earlier, census data is critical, especially the legal and statistical boundaries that come out of the Census Bureau's TIGA, the Topologically Integrated Geographic Encoding and Referencing System. So how do we ensure that the entire federal government goes to that level of understanding of the basic data measurement aspect relating to geographies? The location is also critical nowadays. So Department of Commerce, with Census Bureau's involvement, is leading that effort in going towards a measured and effective way to provision the data so you could relate to your local communities, your local governments, and so on. So, thank you.
Naveen, where do you see this whole kind of effort going from a GSA perspective?
Sure. I think that there's really going to be three focuses. The openness of our data, the integration of our data, and intelligence around it. So increasingly, we want to push more and more of our data open as it needs to be, as it belongs to the public, and finding the right ways to sort of standardize our APIs and standardize our data releases along those lines. Integration, as I mentioned earlier, right? We have the three services within the organization, but we're finding value in connecting dissimilar data sets. Even though that, unexpected value in connecting to similar data sets. Finding ways to really focus on that and drive mission in that direction and have us cross those boundaries even internally to our organization, as it is in some way a service and sales organization for the federal government. And I think lastly, the intelligence end is something where we have to start this exploration. The amount of data that we're collecting isn't really feasible for individuals to really process in a way that's valuable and useful to decision making without big hills to climb. So how do we increasingly apply big data and, more importantly, intelligent analysis and intelligent systems to attack especially things like natural language and other data sets along those lines in a way that provides at least guidance to people who are using that, if not supporting decision making.
Mm-hmm. John, you get the last word of the day of the panel. Take us home. Where's this, from MarkLogic's perspective, where's this all heading? where would you like to see everyone in the next 3, 4, 5 years?
Yeah, well, I think I'd like to see all of the agencies looking at the next generation, the new generation of database technology, because it's really evolved over the last 5 years in particular. The flexibility, the reliability, and the security that's there in that now new generation of database technology far exceeds what agencies are used to using in their incumbent database providers. And MarkLogic leads that field. We're pervasive across federal government, and I think it's an interesting technology for all of these problems.
And in many ways, this idea of the integration and the agility that's been happening, do you get a sense that, again, the boulder rolling uphill is getting there? I mean, as I talked about in the earlier part of it, it's been a long haul.
Yeah, it's been a long haul. I think that the technology again has evolved to the point where it makes the technology part of that easier. The federal government's acquisition cycles and the bureaucracy of sharing data still are problematic, but breaking down. But I see progress, and I'm optimistic.
All right, good optimism. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. You've been listening to the panel discussion, Tearing Down Government Silos, the Impact of Data Integration, sponsored by MarkLogic on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I've been your host, Jason Miller. I'd like to thank my guests today, Thomas Beach, the Senior Advisor for the Office of the Undersecretary of Commerce for Intellectual Property at the Patent Trademark Office, Kelly Chewbacca, the Chief Data Officer at the U.S. Postal Service's Office of Inspector General, Autry Kalori, the Chief of the Decennial Information Technology Division at the U.S. Census Bureau, Naveen Vembar, the Chief Technology Officer at the General Services Administration, and John Bakke, the Executive Vice President of Customer Operations at MarkLogic. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsradio.com and search MarkLogic.
On behalf of MarkLogic, thank you for joining us. A link to the archive session will be sent to you shortly. If you requested a training certificate, you will also receive an email with download instructions after the webinar. This concludes our discussion. Thank you.